Welcome to the kingdom. I'm Chris, and this is Good Enough Gaming. Hello everyone, and welcome to this video where I will be painting the Changeling from the Tzeentch army. This goes along with the flamers that I painted in a previous video, and there will be one more item coming along after. I got a commission to paint a bunch of Tzeentch stuff. So I started basing this in a Calidor Sky over top of a Mechanicus Standard Gray base primer. I wanted the colors to be a little brighter, and so having a black spray coat would have toned it down quite a bit, but as I've mentioned before, I'm not very good painting over white. So we're using gray. It's a nice middle ground. It holds the colors, makes them nice and bold and bright for the most part, and it's a little more forgiving if you miss spots. You don't have this bright white showing where you missed. So after 2 coats of the blue, to make sure I get a nice base coat on that, we're also going to base coat the arms in Celestra Gray. There's actually going to be quite a few layers going on these arms. So like with the blue, you're going to have to make sure that you use 2 coats, because even though the gray is a little easier to cover with a white, Celestra Gray still isn't strong enough to cover it in a single coat. Now once I have the base blue on, I did use a little bit of Cantor blue here to paint the under area, so the dark recess and the half of the cloth that's facing the ground, just to give it a little bit of definition and a little bit of shade. We are going to go in later with some Drakenhof Nightshade with an actual shade to darken the very, very deepest parts, but for now we're just wanting to get separate our colors a little bit. So after that, we're going to use a lighter Cantor blue to start edging the highlights. Now you just get a fatter area of the ridge. You're not wanting to make the highlight here really, really wide, but at the same time you don't want it to be super thin, because we're going to go over top of it with one more layer of a brighter blue. So making it too thin will give it a more metallic look. So if you make the highlights here a little bit fatter, it'll maintain that look that it's cloth. So just going around the model, making sure anywhere you have really raised or sharp edges, that's where we're going to put this first highlight. Now in this part here, I know it's not a super raised or sharp edge, but I wanted to still add a little bit of variety to the color here. So I tested out a few things. Painting that larger fold there, a lighter blue, and here doing a thinner kind of stripe up the side. Again, trying just to give it a little bit of difference and variety. So let me know if you think it works or if I should have just left it. Alright, that Celestra Gray has finally dried, and you'll notice it dries a lot darker than it looks when it's wet. When it's wet it looks like a white, but when it dries it is most definitely gray. So we're going to go back over with Ulthuan Gray to add that first level of highlight. So you're not wanting to get the whole arm. Dark recesses, the areas where the muscles meet together, you want to leave those the Celestra Gray. So you should still see a little bit of it in some areas. While we're waiting for that Ulthuan Gray, we're going to do one of our last highlights on the edge of the cloth. So with Lothern Blue, we're going to get our last highlight, and this one again, you want to make sure you don't cover up all of the Teclis blue that was beneath it, to give yourself a nice blend. Let the eyes see the difference between the Calidor, the Teclis, and then the Lothern. So get the just very edges and highlighted corners, and when you're done you'll have this really nice looking blue gradient. I don't know about you, but for some reason I find that blue and red seem to be the easiest colors to work with. It seems they're more forgiving when you're doing edges, when you're doing highlights, and when you're doing shading, whereas everyone knows that painting with yellow is difficult, orange can be kind of tricky, and white can be. But for some reason, blue and red seem to be really, really forgiving. So I'm glad this guy's predominantly blue. Alright, now that we have the very highest level done, we're now going to do the very darkest level of the cloth. So just a stripe of Drakenhof Nightshade into those very, very deep ridges there. Just one simple stripe. It'll collect near the bottom. When it dries, it'll fade nicely into the areas around it. So just anywhere where you see very, very dark recesses or folds where it should be a little bit darker. So now we're going to turn back to the skin. And for this, I'm going to do what I did the last time I painted one of these, and I wanted the skin to have a bluish tinge so that it matches everything else, but the nightshade might darken it a bit too much. I don't want this guy to look very shadowy. I want him to look bright. So instead, I'm going to use the Guilliman Blue Glaze. Now, unfortunately, this color is no longer available. I just happen to have a bottle that I haven't used up yet. So use that all over the white. While you're waiting for it to dry, we'll take some Ceramite White to the base, to this magic swirly cloud that's beneath him. You're definitely going to need 2 coats of it, but it shouldn't be too difficult because you can allow paint to get all over the base and everything. It's a fairly easy part to paint. Now, while I was doing that, I noticed I missed blue on the sash in front. So just go back, repeat the same step with the other blues in the same places. While we're waiting for the sash to dry so I can start getting the shades and things, I'm going to start painting the gold trim. So with this one, just straight up Retributor armor, and take your time because all the little details on the cloak there, use the flat of your brush, go very slowly, make sure the paint's not too wet so it doesn't actually blob or puddle or something like that. You want it to flow off the brush nicely, like you see here. Just use the edge so the very littlest bit of contact allows the paint to transfer, but it's not so wet that it actually spills down onto the blue cloak underneath. Paint the edge of the cloth with the edge of your brush here. I just can't stress enough, you just got to go slow and take your time. You rush, you get something wrong, it's going to be a lot harder to clean up that blue. And I think you'll notice that when it's done, he already starts to look really good. That blue and gold go together very, very well. By that point, when you're done with the gold and blue glaze should be dry. So now we're going to go back over the skin with the Ulthuan gray and highlight most of it, but leave some of that blue showing in the areas underneath. That way the shaded and shadowed area of his skin are going to have a blue tinge to them to match the rest of the model. Once the Ulthuan gray is dried off, we'll go back over and do highlighting with white scar. Now you can decide how much you want to do here. If you just want to outline muscles, or if you want the skin itself to be a whole lot brighter, then do a lot more of the muscles and the raised edges with the white scar. It just depends how bright, shiny, and white you want his skin to be, or if you want it to be a little bit darker, a little bit more subdued. While waiting for the skin to dry, we're going to go back and do our second coat of the ceramite white to make sure we get a nice base to build on. You want this to be a very, very bright. That's why I used the brightest white base paint that I had, because that's going to give a lot of the brightness to the color wash that we're going to put over top. While I'm waiting for that layer of the white to dry, we'll go back and try and finish up the cloth here. We'll just do the highlights where it touches into his belt and where the sash raises up in a bit of a lump or a bump to give it, again, more of that look of definition and to have some shadow in there. Then we'll touch up the gold around it very slowly and carefully. Let's turn our attention now to the scroll work. I'm going to use the ceramite white again, because we'll have a different color on each one above and below, so they won't look too similar when they're done. Be very careful so you don't accidentally get any on the blue or any on the gold. Get a nice small brush, make sure the paint's nice and wet. It's better to do many layers of a thinner wet paint than to try and gob it on at the beginning and make some kind of a mistake. But make sure you get underneath as well as around the back of the hood here, and also these scrolls that he's got attached to his robe. Alright, so continuing our little ping pong action where we paint one thing, wait for it to dry while we go paint something else. Waiting for all that white to dry on the scroll work, we'll turn to the staff he has. And this is pretty easy because the whole thing, except for the very head of the staff, is all Retributor armor. Just painted a nice gold. Be very delicate when going around the arm and the fingers there so you don't accidentally paint over it. While you're waiting for that gold to dry, we're going to do Seraphim Sepia over top of the scroll work. And just one layer of this will give it a nice kind of parchment faded look to it. And when it dries, you won't have to do anything else. As you'll see, we'll do a little bit of detailing to put some writing on the scroll, but if you don't want to mess around with that, you can just leave it and it will look fine. Alright, moving on with our shades. Reikland Flesh Shade is my go-to shade for gold. I think I've mentioned that before, but it works really well. It gives it a bit of a red tinge, but I like it better than Earthshade. Earthshade's too dark, and Sepia can sometimes be so subtle you don't even notice that it's there. So I really like Reikland Flesh Shade for shading the gold. We're going to use Coelia Green Shade. Coelia? I don't know how you pronounce it. We'll use that for the white underneath, for the flames. This is exactly what we did on the Tzeentch Flamers. So this way we'll have that uniformity across the models in the army. Gob it on fairly good so that it sinks into the recesses and fully darkens and colors them. While we're waiting for all these shades to dry, we'll go back to the arms, which are now fully dry and finished, and we'll put some gold on all of the jewelry, the bracelets, the armbands that this guy is wearing here. We'll also, while we're waiting, because shade always takes a long time to dry, we'll paint a first layer on the bird skull on the back. For the writing, make sure you have a very tiny brush with a fine point. Make sure the paint's very, very wet but not watery, and just kind of like Morse code, tapping. From the scale of the model here, you don't want to use a lot of broad sweeping strokes. So just kind of tap, dot, 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 and you'll get the writing there. I neglected to do the flames coming out of his hands here when I did the base, so now we'll come back with a ceramite white, 2 coats to get that taken care of. And on the flames on the bottom, the shade is finally dried, so we're going to get Ulthuan Gray to highlight the flames where they come to the very edges of the tips, and also the raised areas on the model itself, kind of get some definition on them. We'll do the same thing back on the flames coming out of his hand. First the green shade, then Ulthuan Gray, and then a final highlight of white scar. Okay, pretty much all we got left here is the head of the staff, which is going to be a bit tricky. So we'll start again with blocking in our colors. So get a nice dark green, but you don't want to use like a camouflage type green. So I used Caliban green for the feathers there, or for the leaves, I'm sorry. And then Ushabti bone to highlight just some areas on the fabric there, or on the scroll work, to give it a little bit more definition while I'm waiting for that green to dry. Now that the green is pretty much dry and I don't have to worry about any of the paint accidentally bleeding into each other, we'll use the Xandri dust to paint the skull on the edge of the staff here, same way we did on the back of his cloak. Some Retributor armor on the little eye icon. We're also going to highlight and touch up the scroll work on the very back here, and that'll be the last. I don't do any writing on the scrolls there. The ones around his neck for sure, but those ones we'll just leave them rolled up. Some Ushabti bone to touch up the skulls here to give them a little bit more definition. You could also just put a wash of either sepia or earthshade, and it'll look just as good. So in this case, I'm highlighting up instead of shading down. All right, the staff can get tricky. So first we'll block in the 3 colors. We have a purple, a pink, and a blue. So starting with the purple, we'll get about 1/3 of it in the dead center. With this pink or magenta, I guess it's actually more of a lilac, paint the lower third. Make sure you're getting both sides. Just carefully don't accidentally brush onto the feathers, the leaves, the skull, anything like that. And then for the top, we'll go back to our base Calidor sky, so that way the staff will still blend in with the rest of his clothing and robes. So once we get the other side of the head of the staff done, will come the tricky part, is a wet blend. So put a wet blob of the blue next to a wet blob of the purple, clean off the brush, and then just like we do with the flamers, swirl the paint back and forth, circular motion, very, very gentle up and down motion, and you'll see it blends in and it looks really nice. We're going back at the bottom now, white scar on the very tips of the flames and at the areas where the flame seems to bundle up. You know, if there's a really, really sharp ridge or something, put a little bit of white scar on there. It doesn't look quite as good here because you can see all of the smudges on the base, but once we base this whole thing, whether it be sand or dirt or whatever, it'll look really, really nice. Right now, that the excess there that's all over the base is kind of stealing from some of the effect. Okay, the staff has dried off, so we're going to do a little bit of highlighting, some Lothern blue on top of the Calidor sky there, the head, the little fins there, and gently drag it across the scales to just kind of pick up those raised edges and give it a little bit more texture there. We're actually going to use the blue violet, the lilac color we used on the bottom. We're going to use that to highlight the purple here. And then with the purple, with the violet to highlight that, you can add a little bit of white to the lilac and just use that. Turning back to the leaves or feathers, we're going to paint these, we did them green, so now we're going to highlight them. Just the spine down the center, and then anywhere on the side where you see the feather kind of breaking, and you have that little inward line there. We'll then go back and do one more highlight on top of the green with Skarsnik green, and again, just the ridge and the very, very edges of the feathers. And there it is. We're all finished. It may not win you a golden demon, but I think it looks good enough.